Hi everyone, welcome back to Principles of Microeconomics. We're going to go through the first half of Chapter 3 today, and I'm going to start with a little bit of a show and tell because hopefully this will make the lesson more interesting and get your attention. So I've got here a map, I hope it focuses. So I'm from the Midwest, I'm from Kansas, and I was talking to somebody one time and they said, "Oh, you're from Kansas, I forgot that was even a state." So I'm going to highlight the Midwest today because I think we deserve a little bit of recognition. So, in case you don't know, Kansas is in the middle. North of Kansas is Nebraska, and these are the two states I'm going to talk about today to give you your econ lesson. So, okay, let's do the rundown of Kansas and Nebraska. Okay, Nebraska is north of Kansas, and if you know anything about these states, we don't have a lot there. It's mostly just farmland. Both states have decent football teams, but mostly we're known for our agriculture. So in both Kansas and Nebraska, farmers make wheat, and they also make corn. Okay, so let's just think about the output that comes out of each state every year, or what could potentially come out of each state every year. So the land in Kansas and Nebraska is a little bit different. So the soils aren't quite suited to all of the exact same crops. But both states could use their resources to make either wheat or corn. So let's just suppose Nebraska decided we're going to take all of our land, we're just going to plant wheat across the entire state. Maybe what would happen is that the output that Nebraska would get over the year is equivalent to like 50 units of wheat. So you could think of this as like 50 million bushels of wheat per year. Kansas, the land is a little bit more suited to wheat. So maybe in Kansas, if we took our land and we just planted it with wheat across the entire state, we could get at most 70 units of wheat per year. Corn is a little bit harder to grow than wheat because corn requires more water and it's just a little bit more sensitive. So even in Nebraska, they can't make as much corn as they can make wheat. So maybe if Nebraska decided we're just going to punt on the wheat and we're going to make corn across all of our land, then maybe at most Nebraska could make 30 units of corn in a year. And Kansas is awesome. So Kansas can make more of everything than Nebraska. So maybe if Kansas decided to punt on wheat, then over the course of a year, Kansas could make up to 40 units of wheat. So again, I'm just kind of making these numbers up, but you can think of these as like millions of bushels per year. Okay, the important thing is the numbers that I have up here are consistent with the max yields, and I'm going to say per year, but it's in a given time period. And you can think of this maybe in millions of bushels. Okay, so this is what we've got so far. So we've got two places that can produce two things, and on the table we have the maximum number of units that each place could produce of each thing. Well, what an economist can do with this is we can take these maximum yields and we can use them to construct something called a production's possibility frontier. So we usually abbreviate this as a PPF, but PPF stands for Production Possibilities Frontier. Okay, the name is actually very descriptive. So what a PPF tells us is the frontier of what is possible for some person, state, country to produce. So in other words, since we're thinking about the frontier of what's possible, anything that extends beyond the PPF is feasibly impossible to produce. And if you're inside the PPF, then you're inside what's feasible, so it's definitely feasible for you to produce inside the PPF. But along the frontier, you're at the boundary of what's feasibly possible to produce. So we typically draw these in a graph. So what we can do is we can have one PPF for Nebraska and one PPF for Kansas. So let's start with Nebraska. So Nebraska's PPF would plot against each other the two things that Nebraska could produce. So Nebraska could either make wheat or Nebraska could make corn. And if Nebraska took all of their land and they used all of it for wheat production, then what's possible is they could make 50 units of wheat. But if they were using all of their land for wheat production, then that would come with 0 units of corn. So it would be possible at the frontier for Nebraska to make 50 units of wheat and 0 units of corn. So there's going to be a coordinate there. We also know that it's possible for Nebraska to use all of their land to make corn, and if they did so, they get 30 units of corn. But then if they're using all their land, they don't have any land left for wheat. So in that case, they'd have 30 units of corn and 0 units of wheat. So we can go over here to 30, and there's going to be another coordinate there. And then if we simply connect the dots, then this is going to be the PPF. So along this line, there are different coordinates. Each of those coordinates corresponds to a particular wheat-corn combination. Each of those combinations is feasible for Nebraska to produce once they've used all their land. So it would be feasible for Nebraska to use all their land, get 50 units of wheat, no corn. They could use all their land, get 30 units of corn, no wheat. They could also use all their land and get 25 units of wheat and 15 units of corn. But something like this, where you have 50 units of wheat and 30 units of corn, that's outside of the frontier, so that's not possible. So Nebraska doesn't have enough land and resources to produce that combination. Any combination along the curve, again, is feasible for them to produce. It would be feasible for them to produce something like this, so maybe 20 units of wheat, 10 units of corn, but that's not at the frontier of what's possible. So again, the PPF is just telling us if you blow all your resources and just like really use every last piece of energy and resources that you have, then these are the output combinations that you could feasibly produce at the frontier. Okay, similarly, Kansas is going to have a PPF. So Kansas's PPF, we'll just plot wheat against corn for consistency. And in Kansas, if we use all of our land for wheat production, we can get 70 units of wheat. So not quite drawn to scale, but you can get the idea. Or if Kansas used all of their land for corn production, Kansas could get 40 units of corn. But again, if you're using all your land for corn, then you're going to have 0 wheat. So when wheat is 0, corn is going to be 40. And then again, if you connect the dots, this gives us the PPF for Kansas. So any coordinate along this graph is going to correspond again to some combination of wheat and corn that is feasible for Kansas to produce if they're using all of their land. Any coordinate outside of PPF is not feasible. Kansas doesn't have enough resources to produce that much wheat and that much corn. Okay, so this is part 1 of the lesson, what a production possibilities frontier is. Okay, we're going to have a whole bunch of definitions today, so make sure you're writing all this down. And each definition is going to give us something that we can solve for. So definition number 1 is absolute advantage. Okay, what is absolute advantage? I'll read it to you first and then I'll write. So absolute advantage is the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs. So it's the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs. Okay, now let's think about this in the context of farming. So both Kansas and Nebraska can produce these two goods. What are the inputs they have? Well, they both have land. The size of Kansas and Nebraska are pretty much the same, so they're starting with basically the same geographic space. But then the other resource they have is time. So these are yields they could get in a year. So if we gave them more time, if we gave them like 2 years, then they could double their yield. So time is really the main input that we're kind of giving to these two states. So let's think about how many days it would take for Nebraska to produce 1 unit of wheat, 1 unit of corn, how many days it would take for Kansas to produce 1 unit of wheat, 1 unit of corn, and that will tell us how much input we need to produce 1 unit of output in each state. Okay, for space I'm going to erase. But what we're going to do is we're going to calculate 4 things. So thing number 1 is how many days it takes for Nebraska to produce 1 unit of wheat. So it takes Nebraska, how many days produce 1 wheat? Well, if across 365 days they can produce 50 units of wheat, then 365 divided by 50, which is 7.3 days, is kind of the inputs that Nebraska needs to produce 1 wheat. So to produce 1 unit of wheat. Okay, what about Kansas? So how many days does it take Kansas to produce 1 unit of wheat? So it takes Kansas 365 divided by 70 days, 365 days divided by 70 units, which is equivalent to 5.2 days to produce 1 unit of wheat. Okay, with just this, we can figure out which state has the absolute advantage in wheat production. So absolute advantage says you can make something, 1 unit of thing, using fewer inputs. Well, if Nebraska wants to make 1 wheat, how many inputs does it need? It needs 7.3 days. If Kansas wants to produce 1 wheat, how many units does it need? It only needs 5.2 days. So based on this, we can say Kansas has the absolute advantage in wheat production. And again, the reason we see this is simply because it takes less time for Kansas to do the exact same thing. So we can just kind of crank out wheat at a faster rate. Okay, so that's how it goes with wheat, and it should make sense just from the table too. So in the table, we fixed the time, but we've just looked at how many units they can kind of churn out in a fixed unit of time, and we see Kansas can churn out more wheat. So from the table, it's pretty intuitive that Kansas has the absolute advantage. When you actually go through the math and figure out how many inputs they need to crank out 1 unit, we see that there's fewer inputs required in Kansas than there are in Nebraska. Okay, now we can do the same thing for corn production. This will get a little bit repetitive, but hopefully this will help drill it in so you won't have any issues on it when you have to do your own work. Okay, so let's think about Nebraska producing corn. So it takes Nebraska 365 days over 30 units of corn, which is 12.2 days, to produce 1 unit of corn. And what about Kansas? We do the exact same thing. So it takes Kansas, and then we'll take 365, now divided by 40, which is equivalent to, did the math in advance, 1.9 days to produce 1 unit of corn. Okay, so who has the absolute advantage in corn production? Well, to get 1 unit of corn, it takes Nebraska over 12 days to produce it. To get 1 unit of corn, it takes Kansas just over 9 days to produce it. So Kansas can produce the same number of units, 1, in less time, or using fewer inputs. So again, Kansas is going to have the absolute advantage in corn production. So Kansas has absolute advantage in corn production. Okay, again, this should not be surprising if you're just kind of internalizing the table. So if you look at the table again, where we fix time, well, in a fixed unit of time, Kansas can crank out more corn than Nebraska can. So basically, absolute advantage is just kind of like who can do it better. And in this case, Kansas can make wheat better or more efficiently, and Kansas can produce corn more efficiently than Nebraska. Okay, so that's absolute advantage. The next thing we're going to think about is going to bring us to definition number 2. And definition number 2 is opportunity cost. Okay, so def 2, opportunity cost. Okay, what is an opportunity cost? An opportunity cost is what you have to give up to obtain some item. So I'll write and then explain. So what you have to give up to obtain some item. Okay, there's opportunity costs pretty much everywhere in the world. It's not exclusive to farming by any means. So there's an opportunity cost for you watching this class. So because you're watching this class, you're not sleeping. So that's an opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is basically thinking about if I weren't choosing this one thing that I'm choosing, what would I instead have or what would I instead be doing? That thing that I'm not doing because I'm doing this, that's the cost of doing this. So that's my opportunity cost. It's the opportunity that I'm forfeiting because I'm doing something else. Okay, so now let's think about this in terms of farming. So for farming, we can calculate the opportunity cost for each state to produce 1 unit of each type of crop. So let's start with Nebraska again, and let's think about Nebraska's opportunity cost to make 1 unit of wheat. Okay, Nebraska's opportunity cost to produce 1 wheat is going to be equal to, okay, so now we have to just turn our brains on for a minute. So again, Nebraska is not able to simultaneously produce 50 units of wheat and 30 units of corn. It's either they produce this much wheat and no corn, or this much corn and no wheat. So this kind of gives us the trade-off ratio between the two. So the trade-off ratio, in terms of how much they have to give up to make 1 unit of wheat, is going to be equivalent to 30 over 50, which is equal to 0.6 units of corn. Okay, so just, again, engage this for a minute. For every 1 unit of wheat Nebraska is making, they are choosing implicitly not to make 0.6 units of corn. So this is the opportunity that they are forfeiting. This is the cost of making each 1 unit of wheat. Okay, let's think about Kansas. So Kansas's opportunity cost to produce 1 wheat, well, either they're going to make 70 units of wheat, no corn, or 40 units of corn, no wheat. So again, this tells us the trade-off. So how many units of corn do they have to forfeit for each 1 unit of wheat they're making? Well, they're going to have to forfeit the equivalent of 40 over 70, which is equal to 0.57, and then the unit is corn. So in other words, for every 1 unit of wheat Kansas is making, they're forfeiting producing 0.57 units of corn. Okay, let's just do this one more time for corn, and then we'll hopefully be really familiar with how this works. So what is Nebraska's opportunity cost to produce 1 unit of corn? Well, it's the same, the trade-off hasn't changed, but now we're thinking about making 1 of this instead of 1 of this. So all we're going to do when we calculate the opportunity cost for the other good is just we're going to flip the numerator and the denominator. So we're going to have 50 over 3, which equals 1.666, and now the label is going to be wheat. So the intuition here is for each 1 unit of corn Nebraska chooses to produce, they are forfeiting the production of 1.666 units of wheat. And then the last opportunity cost we can calculate is Kansas's opportunity cost to produce 1 corn. And again, we're just going to do a flip-flop in terms of the numerator and the denominator. So this is going to be 70 over 40, which equals 1.75 wheat. Okay, again, intuition here is for every 1 unit of corn Kansas wants and chooses to produce, they are giving up the production of 1.75 units of wheat. Okay, hopefully this is not too hard at all. We're going to get to the last definition, and then I'm going to kind of try to tie this up, and I'll give you some practice examples, and then I'll let you go for the day just so we can get part 1 in more deeply. So last definition, definition 3, is comparative advantage. Okay, recall we already talked about absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is basically who can do it better. Comparative advantage is who can do it relatively better. So the definition is the ability to produce make sure I give you an exact definition, to produce something at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. The ability to produce something at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. Okay, I erased the opportunity costs from the board because my work setup isn't very good, but you should still have it on your paper. So look up on your notes and look at the opportunity costs for, let's say, wheat production. So in the wheat market, which state had the lower opportunity cost? It was Kansas. And so that's going to tell us that Kansas has the comparative advantage in wheat production. Okay, now let's look at the corn market. So again, glance up at your notes and look at the opportunity cost for each state to make 1 unit of corn, and then see which state had the lower opportunity cost. Okay, it should be Nebraska that has the lowest number. So that's going to tell us that Nebraska is going to have the comparative advantage in making corn, even though they don't have the absolute advantage in making corn. So put this in our notes and then we'll discuss. So Nebraska has the comparative advantage in corn production. Okay, next class I'm going to talk about why this is significant. But for now, I just want you to make sure you understand all these definitions. So the 3 main things you need to understand for today's class are, 1, what is absolute advantage? Absolute advantage is just given to people, places, countries that are producing 2 things. The person, place, country that has the absolute advantage is the one who can crank out something using less inputs. In this case, Kansas just kind of cranks out crops more efficiently than Nebraska, so Kansas is going to have an absolute advantage in wheat and in corn. The second thing you need to make sure is kind of drilled into your mind is, what is an opportunity cost? An opportunity cost is what you forfeit because you have opted for another alternative. So in this case, the opportunity costs are going to be the ratios of your max yields that you would get in one of these 2 scenarios that you might be picking between. So, for example, Kansas, if you're choosing to just use all your land for one single crop, Either you're going to get 70 units of wheat, no corn, or you're going to get 40 units of corn, no wheat. That gives us the trade-off. So we can just use the ratio of these two things to figure out the opportunity cost for wheat or corn. That's number 2. Okay, number 3, in terms of the important thing you need to make sure you understand today, is what is a comparative advantage? Okay, note that comparative advantage is different than absolute advantage. Comparative advantage says, what are you relatively better at doing compared to the other producer? So we've got 2 producers here. We've got Nebraska and Kansas. They're both producing crops. And comparative advantage says, okay, for a given product, which place can produce that product at a lower opportunity cost? That place has a comparative advantage. You go to the next crop. You ask yourself, which place can produce this crop at a lower opportunity cost? That place is the one that has the comparative advantage in corn. Okay, one very important thing to make sure is kind of drilled into your head. It is impossible for a single state or producer or whatever to have a comparative advantage in all things. So I'll write this down just so you don't miss this. So here's big red notes. It is impossible for a producer to have a comparative advantage in everything. Instead, each place or each producer is going to have comparative advantage in one of the things. However, I'll put this in parentheses, it is definitely possible for a single producer to have an absolute advantage in everything. So in this case, Kansas had absolute advantage in wheat and corn. Kansas only had the comparative advantage in wheat. Nebraska had the comparative advantage in corn. So in parentheses, but a single producer can have an absolute advantage in everything. Okay, so to give you one other kind of example in case this doesn't really sink in terms of intuition, think about family. So you've got some people in the family who are old and they're adults, you've got other people in the family who are young and they're kids, and you have to have chores kind of distributed across people in the family. What's probably true is that the parents can probably wash dishes faster than kids. Parents can probably also vacuum faster than kids. Parents can do taxes faster than kids. And so parents kind of have an absolute advantage in everything. They're just better at it. But our theory says that parents can't have the comparative advantage in everything. Instead, for comparative advantage, you have to think about the opportunity costs. So what's typically true in most families is kids do not get the responsibility for doing taxes, but they do get the responsibility for cleaning the dishes and taking out the trash. And that's because children typically have a comparative advantage in those things. And so what we're going to show next class is if you have places, and specifically you have countries, if we're thinking about international trade, then if each country specializes in producing the thing that they have the comparative advantage in, and then they trade, then the whole world ends up with more output to consume than if each country was trying to kind of handle producing a subset of each of the things and then not trade. But that's next class. So for now, if you have any questions about these definitions, let me know. I'll try to answer. And then after 10 minutes, we will meet back and I'll give you an opportunity to practice this on your own. Okay, so now it's time for the exercise. I have a scenario up on the board for you that I'm going to explain, and then I'll get to the questions in a minute. So the scenario is, suppose we're thinking about two countries, and the two countries are going to be India and Venezuela. And each of these two countries can produce one of two goods, or they can produce some combination of these two goods. So they can either make coffee or they can make prescription drugs. The numbers in the table here are going to correspond to the maximum number of units each country could produce in 1 year. So for example, if we're thinking about India, then at most India can make 5 units of coffee in a year. If they're actually making 5 units of coffee, that means they're using all their resources for coffee production, so they're not going to get any prescription drugs. But it's possible for them to just exhaust all resources in coffee production to make 5. Alternatively, if India wanted to just take all their resources and exhaust them towards making prescription drugs, then at most they can make 3 units of prescription drugs, but then they wouldn't have any coffee. So these are kind of the two extremes of what would be possible for them to produce if they were just going to max out on the production of one of these two things. And similar thing for Venezuela. So Venezuela could make at most 4 units of coffee or 1 unit of prescription drugs. Okay, now the questions you have to answer. So question number 1 is I want you to answer which country has the absolute advantage in coffee production. So your response will either be India or Venezuela. Question number 2 is which country has the absolute advantage in prescription drug production? Okay, question 3 is I want you to think about which country has the comparative advantage in coffee production. And then for 4, we're just going to round it out, and I want you to answer which country has a comparative advantage in prescription drug production. Okay, the big hint for questions 3 and 4 is you need to calculate opportunity cost to be able to respond to 3 and 4 correctly. So number 3, for example, when you're trying to figure out who has the comparative advantage in coffee production, to answer this, you need to go to the table. You need to say, what is India's opportunity cost to make 1 unit of coffee? What is Venezuela's opportunity cost to make 1 unit of coffee? You have 2 opportunity costs now, one for India, one for Venezuela. You look at which one's smaller. That's your answer to 3. Similarly, for number 4, when you're thinking about comparative advantage in prescription drug production, come back up to the table, say, what is India's opportunity cost to make 1 prescription drug? What is Venezuela's opportunity cost to make 1 prescription drug? Again, you're going to have 2 opportunity costs in your hand. You look at which one's smaller. Whichever one is smaller, it's that country that has the comparative advantage in prescription drug production. So make sure that this is all clear for next class because we're going to build upon it when we finish up Chapter 3. So good luck on the exercise and enjoy the rest of your day.